Tonight's talk is The Good Life, the Humanist View. Leslie Allan will begin by sharing how his early experiences shape his humanist outlook today. He will then outline what he considers to be the three core principles underlying the humanist worldview: reason and evidence, compassion and equality, and autonomy and dignity. Les illustrates the application of these principles with historical and contemporary examples. He then draws upon each of these principles to tease out what it means to live a good life, a life of meaning and purpose. Just a little background on Les. Many of us know him well. Over a decade, Les Allan studied philosophy and history of religions at La Trobe University. In his working life, Les's career spanned electronics, information technology, training and development, and business improvement. Over the years, Les has authored many articles and given various talks on humanism, ethics, religion, and philosophy. Les currently serves on the committee of Humanist Victoria and is owner and manager of rationalrealm.com, a website dedicated to exploring the boundaries between science and philosophy. We have an audience gathered, excited to hear your thoughts on The Good Life, a humanist view. Over to you, Les.
Thanks, Akiva, for that introduction. As Akiva intimated, I want to cover three things tonight. First, I want to say a little about how I became a humanist, about what attracted me to humanism, and then I'll share a little of what humanism means to me. I'll outline what I think are the three guiding principles of humanism. And then finally, I want to explore a humanist view of the good life. What are the things that give our lives meaning and purpose? So I want to start by saying a little bit about my background, because I think that will illuminate what attracts me about the humanist worldview. So a bit about my background. My mother left with me. We fled Hungary. She left as a refugee. She left Budapest in 1957. I was 9 months old. Fled over the border into Austria, and then fortunately she was sponsored by my aunt and uncle here in Melbourne. In 1956, the Russian tanks rolled in to quell the communist uprising, and before that, in 1944, the latter part of the Second World War, the Nazis rolled in. So Hungary and Budapest has had its fair share of totalitarian excesses. And when I reflect back on it and thinking about the history of where I came from and my mother's family came from, I think that's why I have such a fondness for freedom and autonomy, because I saw firsthand the impact that it had on my family. So we came to Australia. We lived in a working class suburb in northern suburbs of Melbourne, in Airport West. Both my parents were hard working class parents, and we didn't have a lot of money. We didn't have a lot of books lying around, but I was always interested in reading. I was always had quite an inquisitive mind. And the first thing that really piqued my interest was astronomy, like I think many young children. I was quite fascinated by the stars, the moon, the planets, and the absolute vastness of the universe and what made it all hang together. And then I progressed a few years after that on to chemistry, and I had a really wonderful chemistry teacher at high school. Because what intrigued me is how, there's some 100 or so elements in the periodic table, a small number of constituent pieces of parts of matter, types of matter, and how they combine in various structured combinations to create the multiplicity of material things that we see today. And then in my late teens, I just happened to pick up a magazine on electronics, and I got fascinated with electronics. I got fascinated by how you can put these little things, transistors, diodes, capacitors, inductors, put them together in a circuit, and they would create these magical things that do literally magical stuff, like seeing people afar with a television or hearing people afar from with a radio, and actually that formed my first career. My first career, 20 years, I became a radio technical officer. And I think what the theme that tied all of these interests together was science. And I think what really fascinated me was about how scientists and the scientific method was a really powerful method for finding out the true nature of the universe, how it ticked, what it was made of, and the nature of human beings. And then I think, as I found out later, it's this scientific approach to understanding ourselves and our world that characterizes a humanist approach. This idea that the universe in all its majesty and mystery is understandable through a rigorous scientific inquiry. Now, at high school, I was also interested in politics and social studies. And I had a wonderful social studies and English teacher that made us think deeply about a number of social issues. Now, the late 60s and early 70s, when I was growing up, were quite tumultuous times. You might remember when the Springbok tour, the soccer team came over from South Africa and were playing around the world, and we held large demonstrations to try and stop it, because the way the South African team was selected, only whites were allowed onto the South African team. The native South Africans were not allowed. So we were fighting against racism, and that was one of the initial things that got me thinking about this issue of equality and dignity of human beings. At the same time, there were massive demonstrations against the Vietnam War, and we were losing many lives, of course, and that got me thinking about what is a just war? What about the resources that are going in to fighting this war? Could those resources have been better spent on building our own social infrastructure? You know, helping kids and families who are without a home. And what about conscription? Is it ever right to forcefully force someone into fighting a war? So these were deep moral issues that that got me thinking about these broader ethical questions. This active interest and participation in the great social issues of the day was another early marker for me for my latent humanist attitude. Humanists encourage all of us to play a positive part in the social groups to which we belong, our local communities, our state, and our nation. But more than that, humanists impress on us that we are global citizens and that what we do at the local level impacts people in faraway lands that we will never see nor meet. For example, how we eject pollutants into the air, manufacture and dispose of plastics, and buy more clothes from the fast fashion industry than we will ever wear impacts the child growing up in Somalia and Bangladesh. And I'm very pleased to see how this humanist respect for truth and science on the one hand, and our recognition that we are truly living in a global village in which we are all responsible for each other, has been picked up by the young people of today. I'm thrilled that millions of people all over the world are taking the lead from 17-year-old Swedish students, Greta Thunberg, and other great young leaders. Through the United Nations and Humanist International, humanists are campaigning for much greater international cooperation and collaboration to meet the very real threats to human existence and human welfare. But don't think for a moment that humanists are only concerned about human welfare. Don't be fooled by the name humanism. From the time of the Enlightenment, leading humanists have been advocating taking into account the welfare of animals in our decision making. The person who started off the modern animal rights movement in 1976 with his book Animal Liberation is humanist Peter Singer. Actually, Professor Peter Singer won the Australian Humanist of the Year a while back. Peter Singer is an Australian philosopher and ethicist who now teaches at Princeton University in the United States. When it comes to how we treat animals, what matters for a humanist is not whether they can think, but whether they can suffer. You may recognize that insight as being formulated by that great Enlightenment utilitarian philosopher, Jeremy Bentham. Along with Bentham, you may have also heard of these other seminal early humanist thinkers, Henry Sidgwick, David Hume, and John Stuart Mill. Now, I'm really pleased to say that the question of animal welfare and how we ethically treat animals is coming more to the front in humanist thinking. I'm really pleased to say in the latest issue of Humanist Australia magazine, and I'm pleased to see Marianne Cosgrove, who's the current leader of Humanist Australia. In the latest issue, this issue of Australian Humanist, the whole issue is devoted to humans and other animals, our ethical relationship with animals. So here again, the young people of today and humanists are taking the lead. I speak with many under 30s who are taking an active role campaigning against the suffering of livestock that we see happening on an industrial scale. I think this is the humanist attitude in action. I see these same young people actively working in the effective altruism movement. If you haven't heard of the effective altruism movement, I strongly encourage you to get on Google and search on effective altruism, which was started off by William McCaskill and Professor Peter Singer. A humanist recognises that in trying to do the most good that we can do, trying to minimise the suffering of humans and animals as much as possible, our resources are limited. With this humanist approach, we are applying scientific principles and methods in working out where we should spend our altruistic efforts for maximum impact. And I think a great example of an organisation doing just that is GiveWell at givewell.org. I encourage you to get on to givewell.org. If you contribute to charities, then you'll be thinking about this $100 or $1,000 that I give, am I getting the maximum benefit from that? Am I helping the most number of people in the most effective way? And what GiveWell.org does is that they do thorough research on all of the major charities to see which are the most effective in alleviating suffering. So I hope you're getting a flavour for why I'm attracted to a humanist approach to life. Now, I want to change gears a bit and talk a little about my life after school. But to make sense of that, I need to say a little about my church life while at school. When I was 12 years old, I undertook an 8-week course of lessons at the local Catholic church, St. Christopher's. And after that 8-week course, I received the Blessed Eucharist, otherwise known as the confirmation. Now, I can't remember why I started that course. It might be because my aunt and uncle on my stepfather's side were very devout Catholics. But one thing I do remember is after I received my Blessed Eucharist, I didn't go back to the church. But also in my teens, in my late teens, my stepfather decided we were going to go to the local Protestant church, St. Philip's. Now, I quite enjoyed my time there, especially the Sunday school lessons. They were run by a delightful young lady. But as suddenly as my stepfather decided we were starting at the church, he just as abruptly decided we were no longer going. Now, my stepfather did suffer some various kinds of mental illness, and one of those was that he was paranoid, suffered from paranoia. So he did think at times that people were after him when it was a very irrational belief. So I suspect what happened was that some member of the church committed some minor action that my stepfather interpreted as an aggressive action, and then wanted to cut all ties with the church. Now, in all of this, as much as I liked the people in the church, I never really bought into the key Christian teachings that the world was created in 6 days, that Noah saved a select few after a worldwide flood, that Jesus died for our original sin and rose from the dead on the 3rd day. For me, these teachings just plainly contradicted what we knew was possible, given our scientific view of the world, and also just did not make philosophical sense. Now, in my late teens, I also started reading some of the seminal atheist and humanist writers, such as Kit Mowat, Hector Horton, Margaret Knight, Julian Huxley, and Bertrand Russell. Now, that reading, along with my interest in science, primed me for what was to happen next. Following high school, I enrolled at RMIT, Royal Melbourne Institute of Technology, and there I studied electronics for 4 years, and that became my first career. In my class was a very young, committed Christian, Gary. Now, Gary and I were very good friends. We got on very well. But during lunchtimes and other breaks, we would get into some very vigorous discussions about religion. So much so that piqued my interest enough to enroll at La Trobe University for a degree part-time. My main interests were philosophy and the history of religions. I studied there for 9 years part-time while I worked full-time and started a family. I became interested in two key areas in philosophy. Firstly, epistemology, that's the philosophy of knowledge, and the other one was ethics or moral philosophy. So with the former, we ask questions such as, how do we know what we do know? And we're treating of that subject in our next Philosophy Matters talk next month. And we also ask, how does the scientific method work? And actually, I spent a fair amount of time on that, on the philosophy of science. Now, the other area, in moral philosophy, we inquire into the nature and the foundation for ethics and how we decide rationally the key moral questions of our time. Of course, these questions still interest me today. That's the reason why I started up my Rational Realm website. Now, it was when I began my studies that I first joined our local Humanist society, Humanist Victoria. It was called the Humanist Society of Victoria back then. We've only recently changed our name. In the last 5 or 6 years, I've become active again, and that's because I'm passionate about getting our lawmakers to use reason and evidence when deciding public policy and framing legislation. I'm also passionate about creating a society where every human being can reach their potential. Humanists act to defend those who do not have a voice, including the poor, our Indigenous peoples, and factory farmed animals. As a humanist, I think this is what gets me out of bed in the morning. Well, okay, that's a little about my background and what attracted me to humanism. Now, you may be asking yourself, but what exactly is a humanist approach to life and living, and how does it differ from other approaches? I think the humanist approach can be summed up in these three themes or principles. 1, reason and evidence. 2, compassion and equality. And 3, autonomy and dignity. So I want to expand now a little bit on each of these three dimensions. Reason and evidence. The first thing to note is that humanists respect reason and evidence. But what does that mean? Humanists think that it is through the use of logic and reason that we reliably arrive at truths about ourselves and the universe. Conversely, we don't consider intuition and faith as reliable guides to knowledge. We think that our personal beliefs should align with the evidence put to us. In the social sphere, we think that public policy should be informed by the best scientific evidence we have available. Applying this principle puts into serious question the effectiveness of pseudo-medical treatments, such as iridology and homeopathy. This principle also encourages us to get acting on climate change before it's too late. Applying the scientific method leads us to a naturalistic view of humans and the universe. Science teaches us that the visible universe is some 14 billion years old, that there are 4 fundamental forces of nature, and that life evolved over some 3.5 billion years of evolution on Earth, with Homo sapiens first appearing some 200,000 years ago. That doesn't mean we know everything and that there are no deep mysteries yet to be solved. Scientists are working on figuring out what happens inside a black hole, how quantum entanglement is possible, and what is the nature of dark matter and dark energy. Perhaps the biggest and most elusive mystery is the nature of consciousness. How do the 80 billion neurons that make up our normal living brain give rise to the feeling of love and the sensation of a red rose. And actually that area of metaphysics is another keen interest of mine. I've done a bit of writing on the mind-body problem and the question of whether we have free will. Now, humanists and atheists are sometimes thought of as joyless worshippers of cool, hard reason with no appreciation of love, wonder, music, and art. But nothing could be further from the truth. Humanists stand in awe at the magnificent complexity of the universe, the beauty of nature, the all-consuming power of love, and the inspiration that drives art and music. I have a wonderful coffee table book that I've got on loan to somebody. I think it's 100 atheists speak out on what gives them meaning and purpose, something like that, compiled by a photographer, and he went around and interviewed 100 atheists and humanists. And there's some beautiful photography in it, but each 1 or 2 pages is a humanist or an atheist personal story of how they derive meaning and purpose in life in what our critics say should be a meaningless universe. Okay, so that's reason and evidence. The next humanist principle is compassion and equality. Regard for other human beings and all other sentient creatures stands at the center of the humanist outlook. Our feelings of empathy and our drive to act altruistically are encoded in our genes and reinforced through our upbringing. As Harvard University psychologist Steve Pinker described it, our desire to help those who are suffering reflects the better angels of our nature. But to whom ought we show our compassion? To our family? To our friends? Well, I say, of course, but who else? For a humanist, what marks a truly moral act is one in which we treat people as equals. That is, where we treat people impartially. So for a humanist, you ought not get special treatment just because you are white, wealthy, heterosexual, or male. Treating people as equals is fundamental to what it is to act morally. For humanists, this imperative to treat people with compassion and as equals did not come from above or beyond. It is the result of our long evolutionary history in which we evolved to form cooperative social groups. So let me illustrate this with an idea, or this idea. Imagine for a moment all of you here going on a holiday by sea. Your ship becomes stranded on a desert island with none of the crew surviving. You are left with some food, materials to make some shelter, and the natural resources on the island. To survive individually and as a group, what rules would you make to govern your behavior, your collective behavior? Would you decide on the rule, kill your fellow survivors when you can get away with it? Would you choose, steal from the food store when no one is looking? Would you decide on, break your promises when you can't be bothered keeping them? Or would you, as a group, decide on the opposite? See, for a humanist, there is nothing mysterious or out of this world about the moral rules that we want others to live by. They are simply the rules that we must all conform to if we are to get the mutual benefits of cooperation and for us to survive and thrive. As civilizations have progressed, the range of people to which we show compassion and equal regard has expanded. Slaves, women, gays and lesbians, and our indigenous peoples are more and more treated as equals. At their noblest, the world's religions actively promote this idea of compassion for all, regardless of a person's religious belief, ancestry, gender, and sexual preference. So this universalist ethos is best expressed in the Golden Rule: do unto others as you would have them do unto you. The Golden Rule can be found in the holy texts of all of the major worldviews. And I love this poster because it shows exactly that, how the Golden Rule is encapsulated in all of the major worldviews. You can download this poster. I've got the URL there in the slide. I've got the cardboard version, but you can easily get onto the web and download it. So the Golden Rule is found in the holy texts of all the major worldviews. Unfortunately, as history teaches us, many of these worldviews have also divided us into an in-group and an out-group, the sheep and the goats, the saved and the infidel, the chosen race and the outcasts. Humanists actively work to reduce this blind prejudice, this sectarianism that divides us, to build strong bridges between community groups and nations. Another way of expressing this universal regard for others is the utilitarian principle. Act so as to bring about the most happiness and the least suffering. Since the 1970s, this feeling of universal regard is continuing to expand bit by bit as we include non-human animals within our circle of care. And actually, the 1960s was really a pivotal time with this increasing uh, increasing circle, expanding circle of our moral concern, starting from the 60s with the civil rights movement, Negroes, other Indigenous people, bring them in as citizens equal to everyone else. And then, of course, in the 60s and more so in the 70s with the women's rights movement. And then starting in the 70s and 80s, giving greater regard to sentient non-human animals. And all of this is exactly in line with this utilitarian principle that I've mentioned here, doing your best to increase the happiness of all sentient creatures. The third humanist principle that I want to outline here is autonomy and dignity. With this principle, we affirm that everyone should be able to go about their lives without unnecessary restrictions by the government and other people. We ought to be given our autonomy, the freedom to do what we want to the maximum extent possible. Constraints on our freedom should occur only when our actions restrict the freedom of others or cause them harm. For example, it is this principle that motivated humanists for many decades, and I must say this is well before it became popular. It motivated humanists for many decades to campaign against laws that criminalized homosexuality. We were beating this drum as far back as the 1960s. Humanists regard human freedom as an ideal because each of us is different. Each of us has our own unique talents and dispositions, drives and values. Global research shows that it is only by exercising our freedom that we can fully put our special capabilities and plans towards creating our own happiness. It is this capacity for happiness and suffering that also gives us our inherent dignity. Each of us is a unique sentient being, a universe in our own right. Each of us is a locus of consciousness. One person's pleasure and pain is of no greater or lesser value than any other's. It is this belief in the inherent dignity of each person and of their worth as autonomous agents of their own future that humanists have campaigned hard for various legislative reforms. A recent example here is our fight for a person's legal right to die if they are suffering from intolerable and unavoidable pain. In a similar vein, humanists the world over campaign for gays and lesbians to have the freedom to marry whomever they choose. It is in the name of this principle also that humanists historically campaigned against slavery and much later for full civil rights for women and blacks. For a humanist, even if there is no higher power looking over us, fighting for freedom and the inherent dignity of all, regardless of race, gender, social position, and sexual preference, is worth doing. I now want to say a little about the humanist conception of the good life. What is a worthwhile life and how ought we live it? The three humanist principles I've just described, I think, give us a way to think about what it is to lead a good life. First, let me distinguish the humanist view of a good life from other ways of looking at the question. Now, you could think that asking the question, what is a good life, is like asking, what is a good knife? How do we answer, what is a good knife? Well, by first asking, what's the function of a knife? Well, it's to cut. A good knife then is a knife that cuts well. That is, it has an easy to grip handle, there's a sharp blade, and so on. The salient point here is that what makes for a good knife is determined by the purpose of the knife. And a knife's purpose is not given by the knife itself. The purpose of a knife is external to the knife itself. Now, you may think that humans are like that. You may think that a good human life is determined by the function, the purpose of a human. And like knives, the purpose of a human is dictated to humans from outside. In contrast to this way of thinking, a humanist thinks that human beings determine their own purpose, that humans have no function that is dictated from above or beyond. This thinking is in line with the humanist principle of autonomy and dignity that I shared with you. Each of us has plans and projects that we wish to pursue. Some embark on a lifetime of service to the poor and dispossessed. Some want to build the best model railways ever. Some devote their lives to finding a cure for autism, or to discovering what's inside a black hole, or to bringing pleasure to others through music. Global studies on happiness and well-being show that the happiest, most contented people are those who can determine their own life trajectory without it having dictated to them. So for a humanist, this is part of what it is to lead a good life. If you want some references to these global studies, and there have been quite a number of them in the last 10 years or so, on what makes for a happy human being, certainly contact me and I'll send you the references. The second principle I mentioned, compassion and equality, complements the value of a life that is lived pursuing one's own plans and interests. To live a good life, that is, a life that has moral value and not simply one that satisfies its owner, is to live a life of compassion and justice. For a humanist, though, living a good life does not require you to live like a saint, sacrificing your happiness and well-being entirely for the benefit of others. That would be to deprive yourself of your own dignity and value. To live a good life, however, does mean alleviating the sufferings of others where you can and fighting for justice, the equal treatment of others, where you see people being treated unfairly. Again, research shows that for people whose lives are deeply embedded within their families and communities, they live more fulfilling and satisfying lives. Living in service to others not only enriches their lives, but also your own. The first humanist principle that I mentioned, reason and evidence, also plays an important role in living the good life. Now, this may sound counterintuitive. What has reasoning got to do with living a moral life? Let me give you an example. Naoma is a cancer patient. She foregoes cancer treatment for an expensive quack cure from a snake oil merchant. Naoma dies prematurely, robbing her of another few years of productive life and robbing her parents of their daughter. Her untimely death was good for no one, not for her, not for her family, and not for all of her friends who cared about her. If you want a reference to that story, once again, just contact me. Here is another example of how ignoring reason and evidence detracts from living a good life. Now, I run another group, Humanist Victoria's ex-religious support network. Now, in my work, I hear all too often stories from people who left a very strict and controlling religious sect. To their deep regret and sadness, they feel that much of their life had been wasted. See, within the sect, they were not allowed to have birthday parties, to dance and sing, search the internet, and go to university. The imposition of these irrational religious constraints, they felt, stole from them their childhood and early adult years. But perhaps the most alarming example on a global scale of how turning a blind eye to reason and evidence can rob us of a good life is our current climate catastrophe. If the world's governments continue to ignore the scientific evidence, with the inevitable result that our climate passes the global warming tipping point, billions of people will suffer. Billions will be impacted by increased storms, bushfires, and floods, and food and water shortages, rising sea levels, and wars over scarce resources. I want to finish up on a more of a positive note. So here I want to emphasize that for a humanist, there is not one way and one way only of living a good life. We each have our own talents and drives to make this world a better place and in a way that is uniquely ours. Humanism is a truly pluralist worldview that cherishes diversity, both in thought and action. Humanists are striving for a more tolerant world in which all of us can reach our potential while respecting the rights and freedoms of our fellow world citizens. So in this talk, I shared with you what attracted me to the humanist outlook, principally its respect for reason and science and its deep engagement with the world. I outlined what I see as the three key principles of humanism: reason and evidence, compassion and equality, and autonomy and dignity. And I ended with the humanist conception of what it is to lead a good life. At its heart, it's a life in which we continually search for the truth and strive to enrich the lives of others. Now, I've put here some resources that you might be interested in. This first one is if you're interested in getting this talk, you can do it in three ways. You can download the PDF from my Rational Realm website, or you can read the talk on the web page in HTML. The last URL is on my Rational Realm YouTube channel, and you can view a video of this talk. The next URL is a little book called Living Well by Richard Dockerer. This is one of the books free to download, put out by Humanist UK. I love this little book. One of the things I really like is because it has a good discussion about how we use reason in deciding on what's the right thing to do and how to live the best life. The next book is another free download from Humanist UK called Being Good by Richard Norman. And what I liked about this talk is it talks about the meaning of life, and it's got a really good section on how contemplating our own deaths can enrich how you think about your life from this point forward. Now, one thing I really love about both these books is they're non-technical. It's dealing with important philosophical issues, but it's doing it in ordinary language, in a non-technical language. The other references after that is where you can find out more about humanism. On the American Humanist page, there's a page called What is Humanism? It's a great summary. Our own Humanist Victoria website, the Humanist Australia website, and of course, Humanist International. The last one is a really important resource for teachers and students on what is humanism. It's a vast collection of resources. This is Humanist UK. Now, I'm pleased to say that Humanist Victoria have a current project with the Rationalist Society of Australia to developing humanist resources for teachers and students here in Victoria, and it's meant for use throughout all schools in Australia. So I'll hand back over to Kiva. Thank you very much for your patience, and I'm really interested now to get into question time.
Thank you so much, Liz, on behalf of everyone for, I think such a beautiful overview, both of the personal journey and the thoughts and the feelings that are involved in living a humanist life. So thank you so much. I love the principles which you espouse. They seem to sort of cover the the considered perspective and the intellectual, kind of aspects with the reason and evidence. And there've been discussions in the chat regarding feelings, which seem to be part of the good life as well. And the compassion and concern for equality seems to capture that beautifully. And then, of course, the kind of practical or political realm with, autonomy and dignity. So I think there's so much in what you said, and I'm sure people will have questions. So
To access other videos and podcasts in this series, go to the Philosophy Resources section of the Rational Realm website at www.rationalrealm.com.